Limbo Lodge by Joan Aiken, Chapter 2. The throb of drums, which had grown louder and louder as the Sawara edged her way up the long, narrow harbor, ceased abruptly at the moment the first hawser was thrown ashore and made fast. Dido leaned over the rail and watched as small, dark men in black cotton trousers darted about, attaching more cables to bollards on the quay and hanging thick rope fenders between the ship and the dock wall. A taller man, white-haired and wearing elegant black silk clothes, stood with his hands in his pockets, apparently overseeing the operation. "Why, there he is! My friend, my father's friend," said Dr. Talisman, leaning eagerly over the rail and catching a pause between the shouts of the dock workers. The doctor called out, "Manuel! Manuel! Oh, hey, Manuel!" Looking up at the ship and her passengers, the white-haired man made a formal bow and raised his hand in ceremonial gesture of recognition and greeting. "He doesn't seem at all surprised to see me," Dr. Talisman said, sounding a little quenched. Indeed, the man on the dock looked quizzical, as if his opponent in a game had made a move that amazed him. "Maybe he got a message on another ship from Amboina and knew you was coming," Dido suggested. "How long was you there?" "About 10 days. I took passage on the first ship that sailed this way." Now the companion ladder was lowered, and the white-haired man came briskly up it and saluted the doctor with another low bow. "My dear Dr. Talisman, I assume you are now a doctor. Welcome back to your birthplace. Manuel, let me make you known to Captain Sanderson, Signor Manuel Roy." "The brave Captain Sanderson of the good ship Sawara. I know already," another bow. "And here is Dido Twite, who has come from Aratu looking for Lord Herodsfoot." Signor Manuel seemed a little astonished at this news. He took careful stock of Dido, who, as usual, wore long, wide trousers of dark blue duffel, a close-fitting pea jacket with brass buttons, and a white shirt with a sailor collar. She was tanned as brown as a kipper, and her hair, much the same color, had been cut close round her head by one of the sailors for coolness and comfort. Manuel asked, May I inquire why you seek his lordship, my young sir?" "It ain't me that wants him, mister. It's King Jamie back in London town, and a long time we've been arter his lordship, all the way from Easter Island," Dido explained. "Is he here, on Aratu?" "I have not met with him myself, but I understand that yes, he is. You will be happy to hear. Somewhere out in the forest in the middle of the island. We shall have him sought for you directly." "Thanks, mister," Captain Sanderson said. "We have another wee bit of a problem for ye, sir. A laddie, a naval officer, Miss Twite's companion, suffered a sore dunt on the head yesterday, and now lies stupefied, and young Dr. Talisman here is of the opinion that he is done for unless the medical folks in your hospital here on Aratu can mend the wound in his skull. Can you be of assistance to us in this matter?" "Yes, my dear sir. What an unfortunate misfortune, for the most grievous part of it is that our beloved and revered island doctor, affectionately known by all the citizens of Regina, died himself only last week of snakebite, and as of now we have no replacement for him." "Heck no! That is serious." "What'll we do? The poor laddie is in a mortal bad way. Isn't that so, doctor?" The doctor agreed emphatically. "Yes, indeed he is. I just checked his pulse and breathing. Both are falling steadily, and are now very low. I fear he will not live more than another 5 or 6 hours." "Oh, poor Mr. Multiple," Dido said sadly. "Can't you do something for him, Doc Talisman?" Manuel Roy said, "I myself was about to suggest that very thing. Here in the town of Regina, we can offer a fine hospital, and a group of nurses who know their business very nicely, are skilled in the arts and duties of healing. All we lack is a surgeon. If you, Dr. Talisman, were prepared to undertake the task..." Dr. Talisman turned pale, swallowed, and said, "Well, if that is the poor boy's only hope, I suppose I can hardly refuse. I can only offer to try and do my best. I did study brain surgery in Vienna for some 6 months. I have a basic knowledge, but will the people in the hospital allow a total stranger to come in and do this? If I introduce you, yes, I am sure of it, Manuel said confidently. I hold the position of mayor and harbour master and head of the civil guard in Regina Town. Furthermore, I am the sovereign's brother. It is true that but never mind that. And, dear Dr. Talisman, you are not a complete stranger to us after all. You were born in this land. When they hear your history, I am certain they will be glad to welcome you. Dr. Talisman seemed doubtful still, but said, Well, there is really no time to be lost. If we are to try and save him, may we have some men carry him to the hospital? I will arrange for that at once. Manuel retreated down the ladder, and Captain Sanderson hurried away down the deck, looking harassed, muttering something about stores and cargo. Dr. Talisman turned to Dido and said, Dido Twite, since it does not sound as if your Lord Herod's foot will be found within the next few hours, if he is away in the forest, will you be so kind as to come with me to the hospital and assist me there, should that prove needful? You mean, said Dido, gulping, with poor Mr. Mully's operation? Yes, that is what I mean. For all we know, the staff in the hospital may be old witches with their heads wrapped in cobwebs and tools made of shark's teeth or bamboo splinters. Luckily, I have my own surgical implements with me, so there is no problem. Dido said, Yes, of course, Doc, I'll help you, if that's what you want, though I don't know a blame thing about doctoring. But I'll be glad to do anything I can for poor Mr. Mully. He's been right kind to me. That looks like the fellow coming now with a pushcart. You better fetch up your cutting tackle, Doc. Studying them as they approached, Dido thought gloomily that the group of men on the quay side, with the stretcher, looked like mourners, prematurely celebrating Mr. Multiple's funeral. They moved and spoke to each other soberly. They were black-haired, brown-skinned, like the dock workers, but much taller, with sharply chiseled features. They looked as if they had been carved out of wood. Dido guessed that they were Angrians, whereas the dock workers, much more cheerful and lively, were Delendi or forest people. The stretcher had 2 wheels, like a rickshaw. 2 of the men pushed it. 2 pulled Mr. Multiple, still deeply unconscious, and lowered over the ship's side in a sling, and carefully positioned on a mattress, stuffed with leaves that rustled under him. He was motionless and hardly seemed to breathe. Dr. Talisman, carrying a bag of equipment, slipped quickly down the ladder, closely followed by Dido, and they followed the stretcher across the wide stone quay. Across the wide stone quay. It was all inland, Dido noticed, with small oblongs of marble about the size of dominoes. They were either black or white and were formed into patterns, squares, circles, geometrical designs. Some of these looked like chess or checkerboards. Others seemed to be designed for games that Dido did not know. It's no wonder Lord Herod's foot wanted to come to this island, she thought. It all seems to be set up for games. Indeed, she saw 2 men playing a dice game on one of the patterned squares. Shiny fronted houses, blue and white tiled, lined the rear of the quay, and rose, one above the other, up the steep hill behind. Some of the tiles formed pictures, women spinning, men fishing or digging. Others were merely flowers or stairs. Dido followed the doctor up a narrow, steep, black and white paved street. The town seemed almost unnaturally clean, bare and silent. The hush was eerie after the mutter of drums as the ship made her landfall, but of course it was early still. However, Dido noticed that they were watched as they walked, through tiny grilled windows and iron-barred gateways by silent black-hooded figures. This is a right spooky place, Dido thought. Suddenly, a small group, a few yards distant, down a side alley, parted, and a black-clad figure darted towards the stretcher with arms outflowing. My son! My son! The voice had in it a mixture of rapture and appeal. Krupus, now what? Muttered Dido. 2 more women now left the group and ran after the first. Dido supposed they were women, for they had black skirts down to the ground, but their faces were invisible, wrapped in black, with only slits for the eyes. Their voices were low, urgent, and concerned. No, Madreda. That sick man is not your son. Your son is far from here. Go back now. Go back to your home. You should not be on the street. The woman sobbed and protested, but humbly, in a murmur, as if she did not expect to have any attention paid to her. The man, Manuel, who had followed the stretcher from the quay side, now intervened. I keep having trouble because I want to say quay side, but I was told by a listener that that word is pronounced key, and I have to remember that it's key and not Q. Anyway, he spoke a few quick, harsh words in an undertone, marshalling the group of black-clad figures away down the alley from which they had come. The men with the stretcher had gone steadily on, as if this was no concern of theirs, but Dr. Talisman had paused. Well, there was still a bit of distance between them and Manuel and the men in front. Dido said softly, "Doc Talisman, there's a thing I better say now while no one else is near. Listen. You're really a gal, ain't you? Like me, rigged out as a fella? No business of mine why you do it, but Mr. Mully and me, we both of us twigged your act. At least I'm pretty sure he did, and I jaloused. As how I'd better let you know. You got your own best reasons for doing so, I reckon. None of my affair. I'm on your side, whatever it is. Buckle and thong, just figured I ought to tell you. Dr. Talisman's level stride paused, hesitated for a moment, and then resumed its smooth swing. After a moment, the doctor said, "Thank you, Dido. I appreciate your telling me. You are quite right, of course." Manuel caught up with them again and told them, "The hospital is just at the top of the hill there on the right." What they had seen of the town so far was all dry, clean, narrow alleys and whitewashed walls, often as high as the houses themselves. Many of the houses were tucked away behind walls, gates, and courtyards. All the house fronts that could be seen were faced with glistening blue and white tiles. Some of these had recurring patterns like wallpaper. Others were large pictures, battle scenes or ships or mermaids or monsters. The hospital, when they reached it, was similarly set back. It lay behind heavy wrought iron gates, a wide paved courtyard, and a colonnade of arches. Palm and locust trees made the courtyard shady. Outside the gates, a black-clad group of people had gathered. They seemed to have learned, by some bush telegraph, of the event that was about to happen. All their eyes were fixed on Dr. Talisman. They were all men and looked unfriendly. Dido heard murmured words, curses perhaps, as they passed in. Manuel acknowledged a few bows by an inclination of his head. Inside the hospital was impressively white, silent and clean, with arched stone passageways and paved cloisters like a monastery. Perhaps it had once been one? A group of women met them at the end of a cloister. Women? Dido supposed they were women. They had green robes down to their feet and immense square green headdresses made of leaves, huge leaves, bigger than rhubarb or hemlock, giant leaves, tacked together with threads of fiber. Manuel addressed them in what Dido guessed to be the Delendi language, using many gestures. Here and there she recognized a word or two. "Now I must leave you," Manuel said to the doctor, "and so must the stretcher men. Only medical staff are allowed in beyond. The nurses will not take off their headdresses while we are present." "Does Manuel know that Doc Talisman is a girl?" Dido wondered. "And that I'm one? After all, Manuel and the doc met before in Bad Thingummy. Or are doctors allowed in here, even if they are men? Maybe they don't have any women doctors." Manuel and the stretcher-bearers left. Mr. Multiple was wheeled away by the nurses. Dido and the doctor were led into a little clean, cell-like room where they were provided with large earthenware basins of hot water, smelling strongly of sage or ginger, to wash their hands, and offered clean towels and white smocks. Then they were escorted farther on into a large, vaulted room where Mr. Multiple already lay on a stone block in the middle of the floor. A frame draped with more of the huge leaves covered him, all but his head. Dido began to feel slightly sick. The hooded helpers now took off their leaf headdresses and robes, revealing themselves as small, thin, dark-smiling women in white tunics and trousers, one of them with lively pictorial gestures. That included putting the palms of her hands over her eyes, offered Dr. Talisman a twig, first nibbling on a similar twig herself. Talisman tested the twig with her tongue, bit off a shred of bark, then spat into a clay dish that the girl held out. She shook her head, smiling. "What is that?" asked Dido. "Narcotic, very powerful one. My tongue went numb." "It's to put the patient to sleep, but not needed now. He sleeps already." A cane table on wheels was now rolled forward with various implements on it, but Dr. Talisman, with a polite gesture of thanks, declined them and spread out her own tools, which were made of steel and glittered dimly in such light as there was, which, coming from tiny windows, was not very helpful. Dr. Talisman turned to the assistants. "Luz?" she inquired. "Au sol? Temlume?" "No, sir," suggested Dido, remembering the Delindi word for light. One of the girls pulled a cord which drew back a blind above, revealing a window in the vaulted ceiling. A ray of sunlight stabbed directly down onto the block where the patient lay. "Ah, very good. Just right." Dr. Talisman turned to lay out her tools, but one of the girls touched her arm to indicate that they had more facilities to offer. These were curved metal mirrors shaped like shallow bowls, which caught the sunlight from above and focused it in beams thin and fine as needles. "They can cut and cauterize besides giving light. How extremely clever." Talisman tested the strength of one of the rays on her finger, then burned a thread of cotton from a bandage. "Excellent. Bueno. Now let me see. Dido, please pass me those tools in order as I have laid them out, and when I ask, be ready to pin back a flap of skin with one of these. Like that. Now this hair must be shaved off, thank you." Having stripped the bandages from Mr. Multiple's head, the doctor indicated the short dark hair, which had to be removed, and a girl skillfully shaved a patch of scalp with a slender white blade, which seemed to be made from a seashell. "Good. Are you ready, Dido?" Dido nodded, gulping, and moved to where she could assist without getting in the doctor's way. A ray of sunshine, piercing through the roof light, had moved slowly across from one side of the space to the other before the doctor had finished her delicate, intricate task. At one point she said, "Ah, look, there is a spot of blood on the surface of the brain. Tweezers, please, Dido." When she had lifted the tiny dark particle from where it swam, Mr. Multiple suddenly stirred under the linen bands that held him and exclaimed, "Curse it! One of those bedamned mosquitoes just bit my noodle." "Hush, sir," the doctor admonished him mildly. "You will be very well presently. Go back to sleep now. You may let go of the flap, Dido." She stitched up the wound in Mr. Multiple's skull with a thread of grass, using a curved needle like that of a shoemaker. Then a pad of what looked like cobweb was laid over the scar. "Put him in bed now. He will sleep for hours," Talisman told the nurses. The patient was carefully shifted to a trolley and wheeled away. A male voice was heard outside in the cloister, and the women quickly resumed their green leaf hoods. "Do you think he'll get better now, Doc?" Dido asked. The doctor was rinsing her hands in the anteroom. This time the hot water was scented with rosemary and lavender. "Yes, I believe his head will mend now. There may be a blank in his memory, but I do not think he will die." "That's just prime, Doc. You are a oneer, and no mistake. If it weren't for you, poor Mr. Mully'd be shark's dinner by now. But I am worried there may be trouble with the authorities over my doing this," said Dr. Talisman, pulling off the white smock and putting on her jacket again. Now that Dido knew for certain that the doctor was female, the very possibility of her being a man faded into the realms of impossibility. All of her movements, her neatness, her thinness, the cock of her elegant dark head, the angle of her neck and jaw seemed to proclaim her as undoubtedly of the female sex. Dido would have liked to ask the reason for this disguise. Maybe it was just for convenience. After all, Dido herself, in her midshipman's rig, was often taken for a boy, and there were plenty of occasions when this came in very handy. There were places where girls were not welcome, especially on a ship, and on this island it seemed as if females were not welcome anywhere, except with their heads wrapped up in leaves. "How long," she began. She was going to have said, "How long have you been going around in this turnout?" But as one of the nurse girls returned to the room at this moment, She changed her question to, "How long will Mr. Mully have to stay in the sick bay now, do you reckon, Doc?" "As long as a week, I'd guess, depending on how fast he mends. Such an injury to the head inflicts a strong shock on the whole system." Dido frowned, pondering. This may be a mite awkward. I'm supposed to get back to Amboina with Lord Herodsfoot the quickest way I can. Supposing I can find the guy. As well as that, I reckon Cap Sanderson won't want to dangle here with the Sawara all that time. He'll want to drop his cargo and finish his trip, and Cap Hughes on the Thrush will wonder what the plague has happened to us. She folded up her white smock and handed it with a nod to the green-hooded nurse girl, who was making beckoning gestures. "I think we're wanted outside," said Dr. Talisman, following the girl. In the cloister, Manuel waited for them. "How did it go, Doctor?" he inquired civilly. "Well enough, I think, I hope." Dr. Talisman's tone was one of calm caution. "We shall know better after he has slept and woken up again. I shall go back and look at him this evening." "Good!" Manuel's tone suggested as his mind was on other matters. "I think it would be best if we now quickly left the hospital." "Certainly. And I think we should inform Captain Sanderson that so far all is well." "I will send a boy with a message. Sanderson is busy taking on stores. In the meantime, pray come to my house, which is close by, and have some breakfast." Dido wondered if she was included in this invitation, and, if so, whether she wanted to accept. She was not sure that she liked Mr. Manuel Roy. He was too smooth, too bland. His tone never seemed to go with his words. His clothes were too neat. His hair was too white. His eyes were too blue. He was like a dummy, Dido thought. A big, handsome doll made just like a man. So everything works as it should. But, take care! Dido was aware of something wildly jerking at her feet. A hand that grabbed her arm and spun her aside. Startled to death, she looked down. Dr. Talisman, right beside her, was breathing fast, but not at all discomposed. From her hand dangled a black and white snake. She had snatched it off the ground and cracked it like a whip. It was dead. "Even here in town, you must always watch where you tread," she said quietly. "Captain Sanderson was most urgent in his warning, and he was right. Is it not so, Manuel? The snakes here are a constant peril." "Good sakes," said Dido. "Thanks, Doc. I reckon I didn't figure to tread on one here in the hospital, but my certy, how quick you were, Doc. I owe you for that. I'd have been a goner." "No need for thanks," said the doctor. "A medical training speeds up one's reactions." Manuel, who had not commented on the incident, led them out into the street. Dido saw that the group of people waiting outside the gate had all left. "Down the hill now," said Manuel. "This way, if you please." "He don't like me one bit," Dido thought. "He wouldn't have cried millstones if that snake had done me in. Why? What bees he got? What bees he got in his bonnet? He'll bear watching, will Mr. Manuel Roy." And Dido quickly changed her mind about returning to the ship and decided to accept Manuel's invitation, whether it had been intended for her or not. But the way Doc caught the snake, that was really something. How could she have been so quick? I'd have said it was 10 paces behind me. The narrow cobbled road. I'd have said she was 10 paces behind me. The narrow cobbled roadway forked here. As they were about to go down the left, turning, they saw Captain Sanderson coming up the right one, accompanied by a sailor who carried Mr. Multiple's duffel bag. "The job's all done," called Dido. "Doc here done a bit of prime work, and he thinks Mr. Mully may come too, and be as right as a trivet." Dido had nearly said, "She thinks. I better watch my tongue," she scolded herself. It had become so natural to think of Dr. Talisman as a woman. She now felt as if she had done so all along. Aweel, I'm rejoiced to hear that," grunted Captain Sanderson. "Now we must consider what's best to be done." "Come and have breakfast at my house while you talk it over," invited Manuel. Sanderson accepted, and the sailor was sent on to the hospital with Mr. Multiple's gear, while the others turned down the steep hill. Over the high white walls, tropical greenery could be seen, a feathering of palm trees against the gable, rich-leaved spinny branches behind iron gates, blue-flowered creeper dangling over roofs and chimneys, and huge red or white flowers the shape of thistles but the size of chimney pots, The air was spicy with a dozen tickling scents, blown on the warm breeze. The distant drumming had started up again, Dido noticed. "Windy up here, ain't it?" she said. "Wind always blows on Era too," Manuel said, "which means the climate is never intolerably hot, but the wind makes people irritable. Here we are." They walked down through one of the wrought iron gates, which was locked, Dido noticed. Manuel had to unlock it with a key, into a pebbled courtyard where water from a spout trickled into a large stone basin among pots of glossy-leaved shrubs with purple and white flowers. It was a pillared arcade. At the far end of the court stood a cane table and chairs. A fragrance of coffee drifted through an open door. "Eck, now that looks comfortable," said Captain Sanderson, and made for one of the chairs. Dido, 2 paces behind him, heard a dry rustle in the shadows of the pot plants, and turning, was just about to notice another of the small pearl snakes slither purposely toward the captain's foot. She glanced round rather wildly, saw a riding crop on the table, snatched it and gave the snake a whack, severing the pearly head from its black body. "Neatly done, you learn fast," said a cool voice behind her, and Manuel, taking the riding crop from her, used it to flick the body of the snake into the flower pot. "Tonto," he called, "bring coffee," and a boy appeared from indoors with a tray of coffee and rolls. Manuel jerked his head toward the snake in the pot, and the boy removed it. "Excellent coffee, sir," said the captain, now not a bit discomposed by the incident. "Now, what's to be done about this poor laddie in the infirmary? I canna stop for him here past my usual embarkation day, for I've commissions on other islands, you ken. I must be on my way. Can the lad be taken back on board, cared for on the ship?" Dr. Talisman looked doubtful. "I'd not advise that. Not for a few days, in case he took a turn for the worse, but best he remain here for a week at least. When will another ship be calling here?" There's the Womera in 3 weeks' time." "But what about Lord Harrodsfoot and the games?" said Dido. "Games?" Manuel stared at her was half puzzled, half scornful. "Have you not met Lord Harrodsfoot?" Sanderson asked him. No, I was at the southern end of the island when he arrived. I heard some crazy tale from my houseboys of a strange Englishman who cares for nothing but roses, insects, and chess and dice." "Dice!" Dr. Talisman said with a sudden grin. "That takes me back to Bad Zomberg. Does it not you, Senor Manuel?" Manuel frowned, as he did not care for such memories. "Do folks gamble much on Eratu?" asked Dido, thinking of the checkerboards laid out in the cobbles of the quay. And there were similar ones here in Manuel's black and white pebbled yard, she had noticed. "Havers, yes," Sanderson said. "The isle's known to traders as Dice and Spice Island." Manuel frowned again. "It is true, the Anglian townspeople indulge in dice games, and the forest people have their own diversions. The hyena game is one." "How do they play that?" asked Dido. "With throwing sticks, tabas, and a spiral board, mostly drawn on the ground in the earth. The game is to send your mother to the well and get her back again. You throw the tabas and add up the value of your throw, and move your piece, mostly a nut or a cowrie shell. At the well, she must wash the clothes, taking so many throws, and then return to the village. There are many dangers if she does return. The mother becomes a hyena." "Does she indeed?" said Dr. Talisman, much interested. But Captain Sanderson, anxious to have his problem solved as soon as possible, said, "Dido, it fair fashes me to ask it, but I'd be greatly obliged if you would go off into the forest at once and find Lord Harrodsfoot and bring him back, so that we can sort this matter as fast as possible. I'm afeard we'll have to leave poor Mr. Multiple behind, but I can weel leave him in good hands with Dr. Talisman here. I've little serious alarm on his account now. That's if we get a good report on him this forenoon. So will ye set off directly after Harrodsfoot?" "Of course I will, Cap. As long as there's no objections, said Dido, giving a swift glance to Manuel. Somehow she felt he might raise objections to anybody else's plans, but he said nothing. He seemed wrapped in deep thought. Reckon I'll need a guide, someone to take me to where the old gadget's got to, Dido went on. That can be arranged, Manuel said slowly. He called the boy Tonto and gave him instructions. Tonto nodded and ran off. I suppose Dido will be safe enough on this errand? How matters stand in the island? How do matters stand in the island now? Sanderson asked Manuel. I've not put in here for 6 months. Suddenly, he looked a little doubtful as to the wisdom of sending Dido off into the jungle. Just now, Manuel said, seeming to choose his words with care. Just now, things are quiet, luckily, but the people feel the need of a leader. I thought you'd said, Cap, that there was a king on this island. Manuel looked affronted. There is, he said coolly, our sovereign, King John. Where does he hang out? He has his royal residence at the southern end of Aratu on Mount Fura, in Limbo Lodge, but he is a sick man. He is little seen by the populace. The populace of this island, Dr. Talisman explained to Dido, consists of the rather sparse remnants of the Angrians, who came and annexed Aratu 400 years ago. Most of them left 50 years ago when the island became independent and returned to Angria. The rest live in this town. The forest people call them Los Outros. The Delindi people live in the forest, which is their natural home, when it has not been cut down and turned into spice plantations. You are well informed about the island, Manuel said stiffly to the doctor. Of course. I know all that I have been able to find out. Haven't I been reading books about Aratu any time that I could find since I took a fancy to come back here? Dido was interested. And do the folk get on well with each other, the Delindi and the Angrians? Well, there will be a bit of a skirmish from time to time, said the captain. Is it not so, Senor Manuel? Manuel made an affirmative grunt. It seemed to Dido that he was not all pleased to have island matters discussed. Then she suddenly remembered something. When Dr. Talisman had asked if the hospital people would allow her to operate on Mr. Multiple, Manuel had said, I am the mayor and harbour master and leader of the civil guard, and the sovereign's brother. Something of that kind, had he not? That's a bit rum, Dido thought. If he's the brother of this Mr. John King, who rules the whole shebang, you'd think he'd have a fancier job than harbour master. You'd think he'd be prime minister or something like that. Maybe the brothers don't get on with each other. Dido poked about in her memory to recall something else that Captain Sanderson had told her about John King. He was an Englishman, that was it, who had been thrown out of England more than 40 years ago for revolutionary activities. He had been involved in the nefarious Pimlico plot, an attempt to blow up King Charles IV, and had been deported. That's right, he'd been deported along with his younger brother, but they'd escaped from the ship that was transporting them to the convict settlement of New Cornwall and had made their way to Aratu, had started spice plantations and had done very well there, grown rich, and of course had never gone back to England, where they would be thrown into jail. But wait a minute, Dido thought. That don't gel, or not quite, because this fella, this Manuel, he used to meet Doc Talisman and her Dutch adopted father in Europe, at all those gambling places, not in England, though. Bad what's-its-name in Hanover, and it's true he didn't seem at all keen on being reminded about those times. Maybe his big brother don't care for him gambling. Maybe Manuel's one of those crazy gamblers that can't stop. Dido knew all about those. Her own father, once he heard the rattle of the dice, was lost to the world, so long as he had a sixpence on him. And even when the sixpence was done, he had been known to gamble away his wig, his shoes, his cravat, everything but his precious flute. Talisman had said, Dido remembered, that Manuel was not such a lucky gambler as her adopted father. Maybe he had to give up going to Europe to play games of chance. Maybe the dibs ran out, Dido thought. Maybe that's why he don't like talking about games. Maybe he had a grudge against Talisman and her lucky paw. Talisman, unaware apparently of these undercurrents, had gone back to the subject of games. Do you remember, Manuel, how we used to play Cottabows in Naples? Cottabows? What's that? Asked Dido. It's an ancient Roman game, or perhaps Greek, I'm not sure which. Very ancient at all events. It is a game of skill, not chance. We could play it now. To Dido's astonishment, Talisman jumped up and walked to the other end of the courtyard, whistling as a boy might, an odd little three-note melody with a lilting refrain. She's real happy to be back here, Dido thought. It's as if it just hit her. But don't she know how much she's annoying Manuel? The doctor stooped and picked up as easily as if it had been a plate of fruit the heavy marble basin into which the fountain played. It was at least a yard across and thick in proportion and full of water, but she carried it across the courtyard without the least appearance of strain, then sank to her heels and set it on the floor by the table without spilling a drop. There, she said. Now, Manuel, we need some seashells. Captain Sanderson had been gaping at the doctor open-mouthed in silence, but Manuel, with a scowl, walked into the house and returned in a moment carrying a basket of shells, pearl, pink, and slate color. He stared at Talisman, frowning, as if revising his thoughts about her. My word, Doctor lad, said Captain Sanderson, I'm thinking ye must have muscles on ye like ship's hawsers. I couldna lift that basin, even without the water that's in it. Oh, it's just a knack, said Talisman lightly. There is nothing to it, once you know how. Thank you, Manuel. Those shells are just what we need. She set the shells afloat on the surface of the water. Properly, of course, we could use wine, but it is a little early in the day for that. Coffee will do instead. With a lightning-quick turn of the wrist, she flipped a spoonful from her coffee cup into one of the floating shells. The brown liquid seemed to pour across in a clear spiraling curve, a continuation of her arm and wrist, sinking the shell nearly to the bottom of the basin. Mighty neat, young fellow, said Sanderson. You'll na find me such a hand at the sport. Instead of arching clearly down, the coffee jerked out of his cup like a blurred hieroglyphic, but enough of it reached its target to tip and drown another of the pink shells. Now you, Talisman said to Dido. Ever since helping with Mr. Multiple's operation, Dido had felt that the bond of friendship between her and the doctor had warmed and strengthened, and the encouraging look she now received from Talisman gave her confidence. Hardly troubling to take aim, she tossed the contents of her cup so smoothly that the shell into which it fell bobbed gently on the water but remained afloat. What does that score? She asked. It's an omen, said Dr. Talisman gaily. An omen that you will live to play another day. Now you, Manuel. Scowling, Manuel in his turn flipped some of the contents of his cup, but he did so unskillfully, and the liquid, instead of flying neatly to its target, seemed to hover in midair and splashed across the basin, sprinkling all the shells, but sinking none of them. He flushed a deep, angry red, but Dr. Talisman, perhaps to distract attention from his failure, cried out, Oh, dear heavens, I have just remembered that I left my notebook in the theatre room of the hospital. I must go back and get it directly. Dido said, Don't you stir, Doc. I reckon you need a lazy after that long job you did on Mr. Mully. I'll go for your notebook. You take it easy. I'll be back in a brace of shakes. The guide will be here in a moment to take you to Lord Herodsfoot, Manuel reminded Dido coldly. I'll be back by then. It's not but a step to the hospital. Dido darted out of the courtyard and ran back up the hill. At the hospital she had to knock for admission, but the green-hooded portress evidently recognized her, unlocked the gate, and let her in. A livro? Dido said hopefully, and made a shape with her hands, demonstrating its smallness. The portress nodded and, gesturing for Dido to wait in the courtyard, went away into the interior of the hospital. Waiting, Dido heard the patter of footsteps behind her, and whirled round, not wishing to be taken by surprise, remembering there were sting monkeys as well as snakes. She had not seen one of those yet, but in the road outside the gateway was a black-haired girl of about her own age and height, who gasped something and made a beseeching gesture. Let me in! For mercy's sake, let me in! Her desperate need was obvious, and without waiting for permission, Dido twitched the gate open again. The girl slipped silently past Dido, shutting the gate behind her, then vanished through one of the many dark doorways leading away from the cloister. One of the nurses, Dido wondered, but she looked young for that, in bad trouble anyway. Next moment, the reason for her terrified speed became plain. A group of men in black uniforms and silver badges, armed with clubs and long curved knives, strode up the hill, looking this way and that, plainly in quest of some quarry. As they reached the hospital gate, the portress returned with Dr. Talisman's little notebook. The leader of the group of civil guard, for such Dido guessed them to be, rapped on the gate and put some questions to the portress. She shook her green-wrapped head decisively, and, after some searching looks at Dido, the party of men went on up the hill. Now I'm in a fix, thought Dido. Should I tell the portress about the gal who bolted in here? But the gal seemed scared to her marrow, poor devil. And I didn't care for the looks of those fellows. But would it mean trouble for the portress? She took another survey of the hospital. It seemed a huge old place. Most of it don't look as if it's used at all. I reckon there's plenty places where a gal can hide herself till the trouble's over. I'll not tell on her, Dido decided. She made thanking gestures to the portress, left the cloister, and heard the gate clang to behind her, then walked rather slowly and thoughtfully up the hill, giving the guards plenty of time to get ahead of her. But when she reached Manuel's house, it was plain to her immediately that something had gotten badly amiss. The gate stood open, whereas she had heard Manuel lock it behind her when she left for the hospital, and the courtyard was empty. It had a bereaved, untidy look, as if something unexpected and nasty had recently taken place there. "Hello!" called Dido. "Doc Tally, Captain Sanderson, anybody about?" She walked to the table and chairs, which were all askew. A cup had fallen into the stone water basin. "Where's all the folk?" Dido called again. Captain Sanderson emerged from the house. He looked pale, shocked, and angry. "The civil guard came," he said. "They arrested Dr. Talisman for illegally performing an operation in the hospital without proper accreditation." "Blimey! Couldn't Manuel stop them? I thought he was the boss of the guard." "There seemed to be some misunderstanding. It's a good thing you weren't there, or they would probably have pulled you in too for helping the doctor. Manuel has gone off to find a lawyer to help Dr. Talisman. He was very angry, but he said things would sort themselves out. He said you had better go off to the forest with Tylo here, and the trouble will probably have died down by the time you come back." "But poor Dr. Tally!" Dido was horrified. "Just after he had done that long, hard job too." "The doctor did not seem too concerned at being arrested," Sanderson remarked. "He said a night in jail was no great matter." "Where is the jail?" "Up at the top of the town, another disused convent, I fancy. You will pass by it on the way to Sorgu. Tylo here is a forest boy. He will take you there. You had better leave at once in case they come back. I must go down to the ship and carry on with the unloading." "Who will go to see how Mr. Mully is getting on?" "I will try to do that later," said Captain Sanderson, looking harassed. "Or you can, if you get back in good time with Lord Herrotsfoot." "Come quick now, Shaky Miss," said Tylo, the boy who during the talk had been standing quietly, staring down at the stone bowl of water. "Is need to start walk our journey from town. Horses meet us." "Chop, chop, I'm a-comin'. What does Sharky mean?" Dido asked the captain. "I think it simply means foreign person. I just hope that you find Lord Herrotsfoot without too much difficulty," said Captain Sanderson, sounding worried to death. "Manuel ordered the horses to meet you at the edge of town." "Going in style, eh? So long, Cap." "Keep your mainels trimmed," said Dido, and followed Tylo from the yard. She still carried Talisman's notebook, and that is the end of Chapter 2.